How do you make Xi Jinping stop his policy of confrontation with democratic countries once and for all? How on earth can we prevent the totalitarian regime in Beijing from becoming a risk and a threat to everyone? VisualPolitik viewers, today more than ever, these questions are extremely topical. China has undergone an enormous change. After decades of rapid growth and technological, productive, and military modernization, Xi Jinping's regime is now obsessed with one idea: to turn China into the new world leader, a superpower capable of rivaling the United States. They want to put an end to the dominance of the West in order to make Beijing the new international benchmark capital. Precisely for this reason, under Communist Party rule, China is trying to increase its political, economic, military, and even cultural influence. So what's the problem? That China is still a totalitarian dictatorship. And that should concern us all, especially when Xi Jinping is developing an increasingly hostile agenda. Do you want some examples? Well, let's see. There's the case of the Chinese balloon that flew over the United States, which was discovered while flying over a nuclear ballistic missile facility in Montana. A balloon which was eventually destroyed by an F-22 and apparently carried antennas and sensors for gathering intelligence and intercepting communications. In fact, as confirmed by the US Department of State, the balloon manufacturer itself has a direct relationship with the Chinese military.
Chinese balloon carried antennas, other equipment to gather intelligence, US says. US preparing to take action against entities tied to Chinese balloon surveillance program, official says.
And to top it all off, we've learned that this is not an isolated case. We now know that we can find many more cases. Apparently, it is a fleet of alleged spy balloons and devices operating in the 5 continents, including, as we've seen, the United States, which is a clear concern. Of course, balloons are not the most dangerous or troubling aspect of Chinese espionage. Cyber attacks are much worse. And do you know what? They've been so prevalent for years that FBI Director James Comey himself joked in 2014 that there are 2 types of large companies in the United States: those that have been hacked by the Chinese and those that don't know they've been hacked by the Chinese. You see, Chinese cyber spies have systematically attacked the United States by stealing blueprints, industrial designs, trade secrets, and all kinds of confidential information from the US government and US companies. They've even got their hands on classified material for such important designs as the F-35, which, as you can imagine, does not make anyone in Washington terribly happy. Do you remember when the US government stopped buying Huawei devices and asked US companies not to use their products? Well, this was exactly the reason. As it stands, the growing clash between China, the United States, and the community of liberal democracies goes far beyond espionage. Beijing's confrontational agenda is also behind news stories like this one.
China aids Russia's war in Ukraine, trade data shows. Despite sanctions, Moscow equips its jets, fighters, submarines, and soldiers with help from Chinese companies.
China has not only supported the sanctions, but as a gesture, it is sending Russia, among other components, navigation equipment for Russian M17 helicopters, communications jamming equipment, and parts that could be used in Su-35 fighters. All this, however, in small quantities. And why do we say that this is a kind of provocation? Well, because, and this is the most interesting thing, it is not a question of massive shipments. If China wanted to, it could supply Russia with large quantities of weapons, if it wanted to. But as we've already said here on VisualPolitik, it does not seem that they want to and risk a massive clash with the West. So what they seem to be doing is sending equipment that allows them to save face with Moscow, while marking their distance from the United States, the European Union, and the rest of their allies. To this end, they are mainly sending dual-use equipment, that is, equipment that could be used for both military and civilian purposes. Be that as it may, that is helping Russia. And what's more, it is a gesture that makes it very, very clear that tomorrow its position could change. In any case, it is yet another defiant gesture. And no, we are not done yet. Then we have what happened with Hong Kong, and above all, the constant threats against Taiwan. Threats that have multiplied in recent years, and that have even led senior US military officials to warn that an invasion of the island could take place much sooner than anyone could have imagined. Spy balloons, cyber attacks, collaboration with Russia, occupation of Hong Kong, and constant threats to Taiwan, and also many other countries such as Lithuania. The result is that Xi Jinping's agenda has given China a much more active and hostile foreign policy with what we might call the free world. So the question is, what on earth can be done to stop Beijing? What measures could the United States take to punish or prevent this type of situation? And keep in mind, this is no minor question. It is one of the most important questions of our time. And guess what? what? This is where the sanctions hypothesis comes in. Could Xi Jinping's imperialist agenda be stopped with economic sanctions? Is this the best way to confront the Asian giant? In this video, we will answer these questions. But first of all, what exactly are we talking about? Listen up.
Economic punishment.
Are economic sanctions really useful and effective, and do they serve any purpose? This is not a new debate. It's been going on for at least 2,500 years. In fact, one of the first economic sanctions packages on record is known as the Decree of Megara in 432 BC. A lot of time has passed since then. With this decree, Athens banned trade with Megara and prohibited the merchants of the latter city from accessing Athenian ports, which for many was the main cause that sparked the Peloponnesian War. A much more recent example was when the League of Nations sanctioned Italy in 1935 for the invasion of the Ethiopian region of Abyssinia. A few years later, the United States did the same with the Empire of Japan and with Germany of the Third Reich. But above all, sanctions began to gain more and more influence from the 1950s onward and multiplied in particular following the September 11th attacks. From apartheid South Africa to the Iran of the Ayatollahs, via ISIS, Kim Jong-un's Korea, the Gaddafi regime, and even the Cali cartel. In this graph, you can clearly see how economic punishments have become more and more popular. Of course, I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anyone. These economic punishments have been led by the United States, taking advantage of the global influence of both the dollar and its own financial system. This is the chart that brings together US sanctions against countries, companies, and individuals from all corners of the globe. Look at how it has evolved in the last 20 years. And of course, if we include 2022, the graph would go even higher. Because of course, as you all know, the last major massive sanctions program is precisely the one that has to do with Putin's Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. Now, the question is, do they work? Well, it depends on how you look at it. In a past video here on VisualPolitik, we already showed you how the sanctions on Russia were achieving very significant achievements, although we have the feeling that they have not yet managed to topple the Russian economy. In fact, in order to avoid major damage to the global economy, sanctions are often targeted at very specific areas. In other words, they can almost be seen as surgical strikes. That is the trend in recent years, at least. In the case of Russia, without going any further, we're talking about strikes against its financial system, government revenues, its technological and military industry, and foreign investment. In this way, what is being done is to try to cause as much damage as possible in the medium term without bursting, for example, the global energy market. That is also why a price cap on Russian oil was fixed instead of banning all trade in Russian oil. But wait a minute, because let's see. Talking about China and sanctions is not like talking about Russia, North Korea, Iran, or practically any other country. Talking about China is serious, serious talk. So the question is, can China really be sanctioned? And if it could be done, would it be any good? Well, let's take a look.
Can China be sanctioned?
The United States and China are getting along worse than at any other time in recent decades. Practically since Richard Nixon set in motion the political thaw back in 1972, things have not been going this badly between these two countries. And this despite the fact that the economies of these two giants are much closer together than at any other time in history. Look at this.
US-China trade hit record in 2022 despite tensions.
We're talking about a gigantic trade volume of just over $690 billion. And perhaps precisely because of this, in recent years, one question is getting all the limelight. If economic relations are so important, can China be sanctioned? Could economic warfare be used to weaken the Asian giant and get Xi Jinping and his clique to desist from such a hostile agenda? Well, take note, because this, in a way, is exactly what is being done. It started with Donald Trump's famous and very poorly thought out trade war. And now the Biden administration is following in much the same footsteps, especially when it comes to technology. For example, on 16th of September 2022, Joe Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave a major speech in which he changed the United States' strategic objectives from betting on maintaining a certain relative advantage over its rivals, basically China, to wanting to make that advantage as big as possible. And so the US national security strategy is no longer limited to wanting to lead, but now in terms of technology and with respect to China, it hopes above all to overwhelm. It wants to be far ahead, whatever the cost. And that's what explains news stories like this.
Biden administration clamps down on China's access to chip technology. The White House issued sweeping restrictions on selling semiconductors and chip-making equipment to China in an attempt to curb the country's access to critical technologies. US aims to curtail technology investment in China. The Biden administration is preparing new rules that would restrict US dollars from flowing to China.
We're talking about the type of measures that have recently been strengthened. Take a look.
Japan and the Netherlands join US chip curbs to China.
These are the three countries that currently dominate the production of high-end chip manufacturing equipment. So, in a way, this is a sanction. The United States is preventing the sale to China of the designs and production of the most advanced microchips and also of the machines that allow these microchips to be manufactured. And this is extremely important. China's leading domestic chip maker, SMIC, produces chips that are several generations behind the leading edge of the market. SMIC currently makes 14 nanometer chips and has recently said it may make small quantities of 7 nanometer chips. To give you an idea, Taiwan's TSMC and Samsung are already widely making 5 and 3 nanometer chips. A 5 nanometer microchip is approximately 3 times faster or more efficient than a 14 nanometer chip. And naturally, for China to reach that level, it needs the machines that allow such production. For example, the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, manufactured by the Dutch company ASML, the most advanced company in the world in this field. But now China will no longer be able to buy such technology. This could delay its plans by a decade or more. These are sanctions that are already in place. But the question is, could or should they go much further? If, for example, Xi Jinping continues to advance his hostile agenda or even takes action against Taiwan, what is the Biden administration really pursuing with this policy? Well, let's take it one step at a time. As you can see on the screen, there are several types of sanctions, but as far as we are concerned, the two most important ones, the two that would make the most sense and have the most impact, would be financial sanctions and export controls. For example, the export controls on technological goods that we have already seen. Regarding financial sanctions, the United States could threaten to freeze China's assets, as it has done with Russia. China has just over $3 trillion in reserves in the United States and with other US allies. However, in the medium term, this could be a very, very bad idea. Firstly, because it would reduce the attraction of capital. In addition, China could react by confiscating Western investments in their country. We are talking, according to data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, about $3.6 trillion in direct investment and $2.2 trillion in stocks, bonds, and similar products. Then another type of financial sanctions would be to cut off their bank's operations with international banks. That would be something like the nuclear option. The problem is that this would sink trade with China. If you can't pay for the exchange of goods, then logically, they are not going to happen. Even introducing minor restrictions, such as the SWIFT exclusion, would have a considerable impact for China, but also for the Western countries themselves, which would suddenly find themselves with a huge shortage of all kinds of products. It would be total chaos. Many Western companies would just collapse, and inflation would go through the roof. Keep in mind that China is the world's largest exporter and produces as much stuff as the United States and Europe combined. So no, it does not sound like a very good idea. And that leads directly to trade sanctions, to tariffs, and import restrictions. Well, tariffs are not very efficient, and Western consumers end up paying the price. And the bill. In fact, according to the New York Fed estimates, Trump's tariffs cost an average of $830 per year per US household. So that leaves us with only two possible measures. Two much more gradual and surgical measures to progressively reduce China's presence in international production chains. The problem is that this is a very long and very slow process. So above all, the option is to restrict the Asian giant's access to certain imports. But here you have to be very selective, because China's factories have to continue producing, and in addition, conflict should be avoided at all costs. Let's not forget that China is a nuclear power with very clear plans.
China is considering tripling its stockpile of nuclear warheads to 900 by 2035, as tensions with the United States are expected to escalate further over Taiwan.
So blocking their oil supply, for example, would not make much sense. It would slow down Chinese production, create a global crisis, and perhaps even a military crash. That's why we have to be much more selective. Is it a problem that China is the world's factory? No, if anything. The problem is that it is a world-class technological power. And you know what? China is still very dependent in this respect. Yes, China exports a lot, but it also devours a huge amount of products from abroad. In addition to oil, its main imports are microchips and other advanced technological products. And who are its main suppliers? Well, I can tell you that Japan, South Korea, the United States, Taiwan, Germany, and a few other Western countries dominate the vast majority of China's technology imports. Therefore, restricting access to cutting-edge technology could be a severe blow to Xi Jinping's ambitions without jeopardizing China's current role in the global economy. Not having access to cutting-edge technology could, for instance, limit the Asian giant's military capabilities. And yes, that is exactly what explains the Biden administration's strategy and technology constraints. Have you ever thought about it? And so, to summarize, can China be sanctioned? Generally speaking, no. The remedy could turn out to be just as worse as the disease. Chaos would be widespread. Let's just say that China's role in the global economy has become far too important. What could be done, however, is to slow down their development by preventing their access to cutting-edge technologies and products. What's more, this would cause many companies to gradually move their production lines out of China, which in the long term may be the best option so as to not depend on the whims of Xi Jinping or similar dictators to provide alternatives. Of course, the problem is that this requires taking measures as soon as possible and not waiting for a possible crash, because in a short period of time, these measures would not be effective. Of course, the United States and its allies would also have to step on the accelerator to speed up their own technological development. This would likely require new incentives for business and investment, an active government policy, and a much more open door for attracting international talent. And yes, China could try to catch up, but the problem is that it is still far behind. It suffers from a huge talent drain, and the weight of large public companies, which are much less innovative than private ones, is growing again. In other words, this strategy could actually work, and even if it does not dissuade the Chinese government from its agenda, it could at least limit its ability to maneuver. This is at least what they seem to think in Washington, and what explains the latest US moves. But at this point, the questions are all over to you. Do you think this is a good strategy? Do you think China's access to Western technology should be further restricted? Would this be a good enough response to Xi Jinping? How might the Chinese government react? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's open up a debate. Now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you have not already done so. All the best. I'll see you next time.